engineering entirely. I finished with a physics degree. And throughout that process, it was really powerful, good professors, good people in place in my life at that time that showed me that the science that I was studying and the aspects of my faith and religion that I was studying really didn't belong in separate spaces for me. They were supposed to come together. And so for a lot of ways in the faith and physics, that's very theoretical. And so I said, okay, how can I take this to the church? And one of the ways that that's borne itself out for me is through teaching people about how to be good stewards of the environment and caring for the earth. And my master's degree is in biblical scholarship, so MA in theology, and I focused a lot of what I was doing on that faith science integration piece, and really tried to hone in on, all right, how do we make this useful to the church, something that people can engage in as a way of worldview formation. How does God want us to view the world around us? And also as a way of biblical interpretation. How do we interpret what the Bible says into practical application for our church? So I told this story the other day. I think the confirmation of my call, and maybe you'll get some of this throughout, but was late night one evening in the dormitory. Sitting on my computer, I found a pastor by the name of John Van Sloten. He's a Canadian pastor who preaches on aspects of science to his church, and he just brings them forward and he says, how can we see God through his other book, is what he says, through the book of nature that he's also written alongside the Bible that does reveal his character, as scripture does tell us. And so he preaches on several aspects. The human knee was one that he looked into. He interviewed an orthoscopic surgeon and revealed God's presence and God's beauty and design in the human knee. And there were other ones too. And this one that I got stuck on that evening was a giant squid. He explored the process of discovering the giant squid at the bottom of the sea, first time catching it on camera. So he tracked with these scientists who went down there and found this beautiful shimmering gold creature down at the bottom of the sea. Why would something be so beautiful where there is no light? Unless we were meant to go and find it. And God was excited for us someday. Wait, there's one more surprise for you way down there. Keep going. So the idea that God has hidden things in his creation that he's just excited for us to find. That moment, I guess I got this like giddy goosebumps confirmation that was like, yes, this is the type of work that I'm called to be doing. It is what this guy's doing. Revealing to people the beauty in nature, helping them to interact with God through that, and also informing them and trying to engage them in ways that it can change their lives. So that's a little bit about me and my call to ministry, to set the preface for what I'll be doing today and sharing with you guys. So as far as an invitation to this workshop, there are a couple different names it could have had. Environmental justice or creation justice, or any of those kind of fit the ethos of what it is, but I think several things can come to mind when we hear those terms. And so I wanted to help us through a couple options for that definition and focus in on the one that I'll be using today. So the first one, and I don't think that any of these are purely wrong, but I want to pick the one that is most representative. The first one, I think, is justice for the non-human creation around us. How do we do justly towards that which does not have a voice in any of our languages? And that really lends itself to this idea of stewardship. God set us up in the beginning, and he said, care for the garden. He told us to be gardeners, to work the land and to produce fruit from it, and to be stewards. And so that really, that first definition lends itself to that idea, which is important. There's also a sense in which I think that when we hear creation justice, those terms can be interchangeable, except that we say creation because we believe we live in a created environment. Creation justice, if we reflect on what creation actually is, we remember that it's not just the non-human. Oftentimes you'll hear people use the phrase, I love being out in creation, or I love being out in nature, as a way of making distinct culture and nature, and a way of making distinct people and not people. And I love being out where there are not people so that I can be refreshed. And nothing wrong with that, I'm not saying that, But I think the term there can get lost if we think of creation as not including humans. We were, the sixth day of that creation. God created us not independent from, certainly set differently than, set within and set in rulership over the creation, but as a part of it. And even more so, not only were we designed to be a part of creation, but creation wasn't finished in 6 days, it was finished in 7 days. God came down and took his place on his cosmic throne and rested. That's the imagery that gets built there in this cosmic temple motif, is something you learn about in biblical scholarship when you study the first chapters of the Bible. This idea that God created a temple for himself to indwell. And so 6 days created the temple, and 7 days created the cosmos that God came to indwell. And so he was there, and he was meant to be there with us. So creation is not just the non-human, it's the humans inside of the creation along with God. And so that participation all together. So what that leads us to is an idea that we are not just here to be stewards in that simple sense of, this is something God gave us, and we're to take care of it. It's more than that. It is that, but it's more than that. We are here to be a part of it, and we are also interdependent with it. And so what that lends itself to then, and what I want to lean into today, is this idea of creation justice being an intersection of all of the other forms of justice-oriented ministry that we're doing. Because the functioning of ecosystems and the security of natural resources and the stability of climate and environment and all those other things hold significant, unignorable bearing on all of the other justice-oriented ministry that we could do. You can think of across the spectrum, and we'll go through it throughout this lecture, just how many intersections there are between caring for the environment, building stable ecosystems and maintaining them, doing things sustainably, all those things as a way to alleviate the concerns of injustice in our world. And so that's the definition that I want to lean into today, is creation justice as intersection with all other justice systems because of the holistic sense in which God has designed our creation. So I want to start out with a foundation in theology and give you a little bit of biblical background. I'll move a little bit quickly through that because it is 2 p.m. A couple of us were saying that's about nap time for many of us. But hopefully it will be engaging and exciting for you guys. And then what I also want to do is take some time to enter the space. So this is already an active space. The Free Methodist Church, I think, has room to grow in this area, but there are many people who are already moving and working in this space of environmental justice from a Christian perspective. And so we're going to look at those organizations and things like that, and we're also going to examine our own ministries later on. If we have time, we're also going to do some exegesis. We're going to look at some scripture verses and try to figure out what bearing that holds on how we do our own ministry. So this is my first time doing this particular workshop, so we're going to feel out as we go how much time we need for each phase. But I've left, I think, an envelope at the end to be a little bit free with that. So, yeah. So that's an introduction. Why is the idea of biblical stewardship in the holistic sense something that we need to pay attention to in the scripture? First of all, we have the idea that God created something good. We oftentimes may hear the story of how everything is bad, but we need to go before that to remember how God created something good. So God began with a good design in mind. And he created, like we were talking about, ecosystems that function well together, the things that are interrelated with one another. And his design was for humans to be in the role of rulership, to encourage the flourishing of all aspects of creation within, below the vault, basically, below the vault of the skies. And above was, he left actually the language in Genesis, it says, the stars are the rulers of the heavens, basically, and the luminaries, the sun, moon, and stars, and the people are the rulers of the earth, everything within that. And so he sets us up clearly to be in that role of encouraging the flourishing of all things around us and be acting sustainably. And there's also the unfortunate reality that those relationships have been broken. When the fall happens, it's not just a break between humanity and God, although that is one very significant piece. There's two other, different people categorize them slightly differently, but there's at least two other breaks that happen there. There's the human to human break at the fall, where there's interpersonal strife that's introduced, especially between man and women is the one that is highlighted, but then also between people in general, that there becomes strife. And then there's also a break between the people and the land, that suddenly it's going to be hard for people to bring forth fruit from the seed that is put into the ground. The woman will struggle to bring forth fruit from her womb, and the man will struggle to bring forth seed from the ground. And so there's this break that happens, those three breaks, I guess you could say, that happen in the fall. And so there's a sense in which if God is coming to restore that, if his salvation story for this earth is to heal the effects of the fall, to remove the curse from us, it's not going to be one-dimensional. It will be three-dimensional across all of those three. And so we're looking throughout the salvation story that God has for this world for the healing of all three of those breaks, or however different people will organize those. But everything that was separated and broken at the fall will be made new in the new creation. And so that is that hope that it's being renewed, that God is working. And throughout the long arc of Scripture, we actually get to a sneak peek into the end of the story, right? And that happens, yes, in Revelation, but also in other places. The restorative, or the language that gets used in the book of Ezekiel, when Ezekiel has visions of the holy city going over the mountains. It's the same language of that city coming back and coming back down to earth when the book of Revelation picks that up, is that the holy city is coming to the earth. So God's future plan for redemption is not that we would be taken out of this world, but that this world would be restored, a new heaven and a new earth. And we can talk more later if you guys want to dive more into that and some of the verses in the New Testament that seem, have tripped people up over the years. Why do we believe that we're being taken out of this world rather than God coming to restore it, which is what has been believed for the long course of history, and is kind of being recovered through a lot of modern biblical scholarship and returning to that. So there's that whole idea, and that really changes the way that we relate to this world. If this is part of God's restorative plan, is redeeming this earth, redeeming these people and redeeming this earth. We very clearly know throughout our teachings in church that we're supposed to take care of the people. But do we know also that we're supposed to take care of the land? Why does that get missed if it is getting missed in our churches? And so that's something that I wanted to help us dig into today. There's also this idea, so I guess that's the holistic salvation paradigm is how I'll encompass that. A paradigm that says God created something good, it has been broken, but he's working to restore the whole good creation that he created, not just save one part and pull us out of it. So there's beyond that holistic salvation, there's also a theological foundation in this idea of stewardship, like we were talking about. And this idea, not that we were given these things to own ourselves, but that God is the owner and we are the stewards. We are the people who are here to take care of what belongs to God. I really appreciated the introduction this morning, the land acknowledgement that the MC gave. We recognize that we are on land that does not belong to us, but the acknowledgement is not that it ever belonged to them, which I think that they would affirm. This idea of land ownership is an imposed construct, but rather that it is something that belongs to God, but that we have not forever been the stewards of, and now find ourselves as stewards of, whether by right or by wrong. And in our case, by wrong, at least of the people who preceded us. So that helps us to avoid this consumer mindset where the earth is something for us to consume and that it exists to serve our needs. We're stewards of it, not just so that we can take care of it, not so that we can get what we need, but so that we can actually improve upon it. And that's that idea throughout that salvation paradigm, is that we were put into a garden and we will be redeemed and brought into a city. It's a developmental paradigm where we are called to be part of making culture and forming and shaping what God has asked us to improve upon. He created and said it was very good, but he didn't say it was perfect. He didn't say it was complete. It was something that we were called to be co-creators with him in and participate throughout the long arc of history. And so he's asking us to participate in this cultural activity of creating a city. I've struggled with that idea of a city because, like we were saying earlier, we really enjoy being in nature. And why wouldn't God create, why wouldn't our future hope be not a city? That's the place that so many of us try to escape. Why would we hope for that in the end? So there has to be this different idea of something good, some good culture, some good way of importing goods and not damaging the places around us that so many of our cities represent to us today. So God is calling us to that activity. Another foundation that we have in theology is this idea of the care for the least of these. And that is where we come back to this idea of intersection. Where are we intersecting between this idea of environmental justice and creation care, or environmental justice and then justice in general, and all the other platforms and avenues that we engage in the work of doing justice around our world. The fact is that, like we were saying earlier, there are so many intersections between the work of justice in all those other avenues and the work of caring for our environment, being conscious stewards of our natural resources. And I was thinking through these, and the list was just endless. When you think of something like we talked about this morning with housing insecurity, how is that driven by environmental factors? Well, if you have wildfires and people's homes are destroyed, you have refugees from that situation who need either temporary or long-term housing. Or you have flooding and rising sea levels and things, or people are becoming climate refugees that are having to, their homeland no longer exists. It's not what it used to be. And there's also extreme heat and other things that are changing what our housing landscape looks like. What used to be adequate is no longer adequate. And there's, you think of public health, if that's the area that you're focused in. Things like pollution and water quality and heat, of course, and then food quality also are all impacted by this. The statistics on premature birth rates and things like that from people who, just by being exposed to pollution, it's something like a third of preterm births can be directly linked to exposure to air pollution. Food insecurity and how that relates to nutrient deficiency from poor farming practices or things like that, or flooding or extreme weather that, as we've seen, can interrupt food supply chains. Urban poverty in terms of land access and air and water quality and all the heavy metals that can be in water or different things like that, or food quality. Rural poverty is one that hits home for me. My in-laws live in a very rurally impoverished area that's been, a lot of small-scale farming and strong communities that have been pushed out due to larger scale operations that make small-scale economically inviable, and just so many ways that that things like mining in the different mountainous regions across our country, the way that has either shaped the economic landscape significantly or done significant environmental degradation and damage to those ecosystems that used to be so beautiful and flourishing that are now completely and permanently damaged. Irrecoverable damage in some places. And education, the way that food quality can impact somebody's ability to learn in a classroom, or air, access to air and water that is healthy for them. Interracial relations, if that's an area that you're focused in, we think of land access like redlining districts, like we were talking about this morning, and the way that the environmental degradation that goes on when you just let houses and all the lead paint that was used to create them and all the other things just seep into the environment, how you leave such a degraded resource when you don't keep it up and invest in it. And indigenous rights. You probably don't need to say anything to realize the intersection between environmental justice and indigenous rights in this country and in places around the world. The intersections there are just, so many. And human trafficking and resource insecurity and natural disasters and the way that those are drivers for people becoming vulnerable to being trafficked as a way that, climate insecurity is exacerbating issues that already exist around our world. And then in global missions, again, similar, it's just there's so many ways that, environmental degradation, resource insecurity, all those things are affected. So, the list could go on. The last one I thought of was just even a prayer ministry, something like a prayer ministry, and working with people who, a lot of people have been doing research, that I've been reading recently on this idea of ecological grief. It's something that in very small scale I've dealt with recently. Just Rochester as a location is very sheltered from severe effects, but we're still seeing it. As a kid, I loved playing in the snow outside. We've lost, over the last 2 years, over 60 inches of our average snowfall, and like 8 inches of ice that used to cover the whole Irondequoit Bay where people go ice fishing all the time. I drive over it every day on my commute to work. And the first 2 years that I worked there were ice fishers out there all winter. And the last 2 years, it hasn't frozen over. It's crazy how much that's changing, but that's the nearly non-detrimental effects. I mean, it's probably even going to benefit our community in terms of the lengthened agricultural season and improved economic opportunity. But other people, it's doing real damage. The ways that this is impacting. So it's really, really significant the way that this is a cross section in so many different areas of the places that I'm guessing you guys are already ministering in churches or in communities or with people in your churches. So the idea that we can look at this as a way to care for the least of these becomes readily apparent when we examine these cross sections. The other idea that I wanted to look at is that this can be a practical thing. Not only is it happening, but it can also just, if we are engaging in caring for our environment, then we are already active in doing the work of remedying a lot of the things that we were just talking about. It works for the church. Not only is it the work of the church, but it works for the church. If we take the responsibility to be good stewards of our environment, then we can be doing significant good in our communities. We can be serving people who need it. And in ways that are more closely attached to the root causes of all these things than just serving needs at the highest level might be. Giving somebody a meal is one, give a man a fish or give a person a fish and they'll eat for a day. Teach a person to fish and you better have a river that's not polluted so that they can go fishing. Take care of a river and maybe you can have people who know how to fish who can live sustainably. And so this idea that it's practical, it works for the church, it's a way for us to be active in the ministry that we're already doing is something I want to encourage you about. I know that people who are involved in justice-oriented ministry do not need anything more on their plates. So when I think of introducing a new avenue for the church to be involved in justice-oriented ministry, thinking of environmental justice, what I don't want to do is say, hey, here's another area, let's form another committee, let's form an ecology club, let's create something that exists outside of what we're already doing. No, I want to see where the cross sections are so that we can all be engaging in this as a way to act out our understanding of what God is calling us to in his story of salvation. This is something that is not peripheral in any way. It's one of the, throughout the first several books of Genesis, God only gives one command, and that's to take care of the garden that he made. That's the only command for the first several books of the Bible. and yet it seems somewhat peripheral now when we think about what we are to be as Christians. When we think more responsibly about what it means to be this restored, or to be working towards the restoration of all things, I think we have to own up to the fact that we haven't done that throughout our history and we need to start engaging in it. But I don't think that that has to be overwhelming in terms of we have to do more. I think that that really needs to rely on this idea that if we are doing it, then we are already doing the work that we have intended to do thus far. And it can join together with the ministries that you guys are already involved in. So with that in mind, I want to not just take that, I want to not just, like, I'm sorry, I'm losing my words here. I want to not, in the same way that we're not trying to form something new, I also want to respect the fact that there are already people here. Listening to the voices who have already been active in the ministry that we're talking about engaging in is really, really important. And so I prepared a bunch of pamphlets. If anybody missed one, I have way more than I need up here, so raise your hand, I can pass it out through these ones. So these represent something that we can look into a little bit more later. Anybody else?
I'll take another.
Okay, take another? Yeah.
Like another one.
Sure. Yeah, anybody can take these two afterwards if you want one. So what this represents is a way to look at, okay, we're not the first people here. Who's already working in these areas? And so the names on this list are, again, with the theme of cross sections. There's a good mix here. I have them titled, and you'll see some people pop up more than once. You'll also see some organizations that you might not traditionally think as an environmental not-for-profit, but they're ones that I've recognized as ones that are entering into this idea of responsibility and recognizing the cross-section and starting to engage in those ways. So I've got a QR code beside each of those. Looks like most of them worked out. One of them might have failed there. But what I wanted to give is just that big picture. Okay, so here's a huge thing. How do we enter into this space? Well, let's learn from the people who are already doing it. A group like Workshp International is a really cool program that is very much international. They have chapters in almost 20 different countries across the world that are all run by people who live in those spaces. And their branch in the USA, if you reach out to them, they'll help you kind of engage this stuff within your church. They love working with people. They have cohorts right now that are working on how to establish groups like this in churches. And I'm sure they would be really interested in working and looking at cross sections with other ministries too. So all of those ways we can look at these more, and what I'll encourage you to do is actually later in the activity that we're going to do, be looking some of these up. Use the QR code and find some more information on some of these. So we'll come back to that a little bit more later, but just wanted to draw your attention to it. So this idea of who's already here. Christian not-for-profits is one of them. There's also policymakers, people who are actually working on laws and policies that impact the treatment of our environment all around us. And conservation organizations in general, not necessarily the Christian ones, but there are tons of resources out there that can of course be used by us and our churches to be engaging in good stewardship of our land around us. In New York, it's our Department of Environmental Conservation. They have a lot of resources. They're not a Christian-based organization in any way, but I go to them for all kinds of stuff all the time to get information. To track invasive species is something my kids and I like doing when we're walking around on weekends. We'll go out hiking, and the other day we were out fishing and we caught these little fish. We're like, what is that? And we threw all of them back in. We went back later in the day. We're like, oh, that was a terribly invasive species that we should not have released back into the water. Lesson learned. Next time we'll take them out and not put them back. But stuff like that. There's a lot of good resources out there that we can be using to just in very small ways or in very large ways, on systematic ways, be engaging in caring for our environment. So there's also a range of community startups that you can be looking at throughout your community for people who are doing this very locally. And that's a really cool way to get involved. So there's two ways to engage with them, I think. One is joining in the work that they are already doing, and giving of time and resources and other things. And that's that idea, like, okay, this is a real primary ministry focus for me. That needs to be something I'm stepping into. But the other idea is that we can engage with them by them serving us. And that's not actually going to be hard for them. It's not going to take much of the time. First of all, it's their jobs and that's what they love to do. Second of all, there's so many pre-prepared resources that are actually already available that can be serving you guys and educating the way that you're doing everything from using disposable goods in your church to encouraging people to be aware in their use of, purchase of, stewardship of land or other natural resources around them. And so that will help us to broaden our scope of our own ministries. How do we look more truly at the root causes of what's actually going on and what is causing the needs that we are addressing maybe at the top levels. Also, working to then address those root causes, not only acknowledge them, but also address them. And then they can, of course, like we were saying, serve to resource you. So that's what I have in terms of presentation. I hope that's helpful for you guys in getting a sense of what we're talking about here. The next piece of what I want to do is encourage you guys to talk through, okay, this is my ministry I'm primarily involved in. Or if you don't have one in particular, or maybe you have a better example you want to use, you can pull up anything that goes on in your church on a given day or a given week and say, this is a ministry I want to focus on. Can you guys, we'll break into groups of maybe 3, 4, or 5 people, work together to examine what the intersection is and the root cause that might be coming from environmental degradation or things like that. And then using the internet, going and finding some of these resources and saying, okay, is there any way that one of these organizations could help?